Welcome to the SAP HANA Academy. My name's Bob, and in this series of videos we'll be looking at enabling search within SAP HANA. In this video we'll be looking at text analysis, and we'll be going through a simple introduction to introduce you to the concept. So of course we do all of this work within our SAP HANA Studio, so I've launched the SAP HANA Studio. And what I've got is a database that I'm connecting to, and my instance is called DB1. So the best way to show you how this works is to actually build a simple sample. So the great thing about text analysis is that we can run all of this in our SAP HANA Studio within SQL scripts. So to do this, I'm going to launch a SQL console. And then what we'll do is we'll load some data into a table which is contained within a schema. So quite simply, we're creating a schema called TA. We're creating a normal table. Notice that it's just a normal nvarchar with length 200. So in this simple example, we're going to load an ID for each row into this column, and we're going to load the text that we want to analyze in this column. Very simple. Lastly, we're going to load a string or some text. So this string is going to be Bob likes working at SAP. So let's execute that, and let's go and look at the results. So if I drill down into my catalog, we should see we've got our schema, and then lastly we've got our table, and if I open that up, we should see that we've got some content. So what we want to do is do some text analysis on this simple row of data. So the way you do that is you build an index on the column which contains your text. Now there are different ways of doing this. We're going to cover all the different ways in the videos within the HANA Academy. But in this example, let's assume we've already got a table with some data, as this example shows, and we want to build an index after the event. So what we're going to do is go back to our console, and we're going to go and create that index. Now the syntax is quite straightforward. The first line of the index contains a command which is essentially creating the index, and it's a full text index. We're giving the index a name, so in my example I've simply called it my index. And then the only thing we need to do is specify the table and then the column which we want this index to apply to. The next line is simply the configuration. So what is a configuration? Well, again, we're going to cover this more in depth in other videos, but essentially this tells SAP HANA which type of analysis you want to do. Now, there are many different types of configuration, and also you can build your own configurations as well. These will be covered in other videos. So in my example, I'm just using a standard one called extraction call voice of customer, which will derive sentiment from the sample text we've already inserted into that table. Lastly, all we need to do is actually then turn text analysis on. So to do that, we use a simple command, which is text analysis on. So when I execute this will actually create an index, but we'll also create a table which will contain our sentiment analysis. Now we've executed that index, we've created the index, but how do we know it actually exists? Well, there are a couple of ways. Obviously, if I refresh my tables, we should see any new content appears here. So in this example, we've created the myIndex object, as you can see here, and it has before it $TA to indicate that it's a text analysis index. Additionally, what we can do is double click on our table and go to our indexes. And if we select the index that we've actually created, we can see the various options for that index shown below, as you can see here. So for example, here we created, again, just to show you one of the options we created, we, for example, choose in our configuration, core voice of customer. And of course, we switched text analysis on. Now again, in other videos, we're going to go through most of these options in depth, but we're just trying to keep it simple for the first time. So now that we've got that index, we can actually go and look at the sentiment derived by SAP HANA. To do this is quite straightforward. All we need to do is actually look at the content within the index table. So if I open the content of this table, it will show the sentiment that we've derived. So let's have a look at some of the columns within this table. So the first column is the ID column, and this essentially is to support a foreign key definition linking from this table to the source table, which was the other table which we derived the text from. So this table has to use exactly the same columns as its source tables. That's why in our other table, which was my table, we had one row with the ID 1, and that's of course why we've got ID repeated. That means we've got and we've derived different entity types and entity values from that string. The next column is our TA rule column. So this TA rule column stores the source that yielded the token. So this actually means that depending on the type of configuration that you specified will determine what type of TA rule will appear in that column. So obviously there are different types of configuration. Again, we're going to cover this in other videos, and that will determine the different type of TA rule which will be shown here. TA counter is quite obvious. TA counter is the token counter which counts all tokens across the document. So what is a document? Well, for us, if I go back to our table, this string is what we call one document. And in this string, the ID of that document is 1, and we derived 5 different entity types. These are our different entity types from that one document. So these are the types of entity that we've derived, and these are the actual values or tokens of those entities. And we'll cover those a bit more in depth in a few more minutes. So TA language is the language of the document. So this is what text analysis derived by default. It was English, was the language of that text. So the key thing here is that within one document, you can only have one language because we don't really support multi-language documents. So it might be important to note that we only support and automatically detect one language per document. But the definition of document is just a row of text. That's all it is. When we come to the language section in one of the other videos, we'll discuss this more in depth. So TA normalized and TA stem, again, we'll cover more in depth when we talk about configurations. So let's look at TA paragraph and sentence. Quite straightforward. If your document has multiple paragraphs, the paragraph ID will be listed here. And of course, the same thing will apply to sentence. And we're going to see this in a few seconds. Lastly, you have the date that the string was created. So this is, the date that the index was created. And lastly, you have the TA offset. So TA offset is actually quite easy to explain. What the TA offset is the offset in characters relative to the beginning of the document. So quite simply, if I look at this line here, number 4, likes started at the 4th character because you had Bob with a space and then you had likes. Let's go back to our types for now in this singular row example. So obviously the string was Bob likes working at SAP. So what TA has established very quickly is that Bob is a person. Also that SAP is an organization. So that's what the sentiment analysis at the moment has derived. Now also the key thing about sentiment analysis is that we derive a positive or a negative statement in that text. So for example, if I look at Bob likes working at SAP, text analysis knows that the entity type for this is sentiment. And it knows that the word likes is a weak positive statement. Of course, you might have a phrase like really likes, and that would be a strong positive statement. Lastly, we've got the concept of a topic as an entity type, and that topic is working, as in it's an ing word at SAP. But let's get some more data in. So if I go back to my console, I'm going to add a few more rows. I'm going to delete what's there because we only had one sentence, but I'm going to add another sentence which is Bob likes New York, but this will be in the same document. Remember, a document is a string. And then we're going to add a second document, but this will have Bob enjoys soccer with a paragraph and Bob also likes beer. So to do this, I'm going to run the delete, execute. Now the key thing here is if I go back to my table and refresh, we can see that the rows are in our table. We've got those 2 new documents. But if I go to my TA index table, you'll see that the new rows have appeared within the index. So we don't need to drop and recreate the index again. Once you add more rows into that table, the rows are automatically indexed, and obviously the sentiment is automatically derived. So just to cover some of those obvious options, if I scroll to the right, you can see that in the first example, in the entity 1, which was the first row, which had the ID 1, we had two sentences. So again, we've got the sentence as expressed here. Now obviously, if I go back to the SQL syntax, in the second document or the second row, we had a carriage return which is expressed here. So obviously this is represented in the index in the TA paragraph column. You can see here it saying that this string here was in our second paragraph. But let's go back and look at our TA types. Now what you can see is that we have more TA types shown. So obviously we had person before. Now we've got locality, which is New York. It's also a region. And you can see that we've got person repeated again in that second document. Now again, we had Bob seems to like everything. He likes beer, he likes soccer, and he likes New York. That's why we have that weak positive sentiment. But of course, if I go back to my SQL script and I say, for example, also really likes beer and also dislikes soccer. So what we should see is that we have a negative or a weak negative sentiment here. And here we have a really strong sentiment, a strong sentiment here, strong positive sentiment. So again, I'll drop the rows from that table and I'll reload them. And then all we need to do is go back to our index and refresh. So what we can see here again is that because we put dislikes, we have a weak negative sentiment. And of course, because we added really likes, we've changed the weak positive sentiment to a strong positive sentiment. Now this TA type column is really important because it shows, well, the token type contains either the linguistic or the semantic type of token. You're actually going to see this more when we cover the different configurations. So for example, because we're using voice of customer, it's going to show us semantics or sentiment. But for example, if we had another example that it could show us, for example, here is company. SAP is a company, Bob's a person, soccer is a topic. However, if we had a different configuration, we might see things like nouns, verbs, things like that. So again, this column will change depending on the type of configuration that you choose. And of course, we'll look at that in another video. Now, not only can you change the words that exist here, but you can also change the dictionaries, and you can create additional dictionaries so you can classify your own words. So again, we're going to look at this when we look at using different configurations, and indeed we're going to create our own configuration in another video. So just to recap, what you do is obviously you build a table. Your table has data in it. Once you've got your table, then you can either build the index on top of that table, and these are what I'd call the 3 minimum rows that you would have to add. There's also a way in which you can build the index within the data type when you build the table, and we're going to cover that in our other videos. Once you've actually built the index, then all you will need to do then is look for the index table. So in this case, because we call the index my index, you essentially look for the name of the index prefixed by $TA_. It's normally in the same schema. You look for that index, and when you have the index, you can have your text analysis enclosed within that table. Now, there are other options when you build your index. So we're going to look at all of the other options used when you create your various full text indexes in a series of other videos within the SAP HANA Academy. So I hope you've enjoyed that short video. Again, we've tried to keep it short and simple, which is a basic introduction in how you can do some text analysis and sentiment analysis within SAP HANA. Thanks for watching. You can see more videos at academy.saphana.com.